All right, here's our video today on Lockjaw, and not that Marvel character, that canine, that dog in the Inhumans. He's that giant bulldog. No, not that Lockjaw. But we're talking about the tetanus, and sometimes, depending on your generation, some people used to call it Lockjaw. Some people still do, or tetanus, right? And I'm sure if you ever stepped on a nail, you thought, oh my goodness, I got to get a tetanus shot. So that's what we're talking about. And by the way, tetanus is that bacteria you see in the background. It's stained purple. So when you stain bacteria in staining techniques in bacteria, if it comes out purple, then it's a gram positive bacteria. Let's get our pen. Let's use white. Why not? I'll put it up here. Gram positive. Now, gram negative bacteria are a little troublesome because they're very resistant to antibiotics. But this one's a gram positive one. And by the way, there is a vaccine for tetanus out there. And it is rare to get. 30 people in the United States, well, let's write it over here. 30 people will get it. Well, we should say may get it. In the U.S., every year, USA will put, which is very low. Think about it. There's over 330 million people in the United States, around that. So for 30 people to get it annually, that's very rare. All right, so let's get a clean page and talk about this bacteria, by the way, which is called, I'll put it over here, C. tetani. C. tetani. And its fancy name is, I'll write it over here too, Clostridium. That's the fancy word. Clostridium tetani. Or some people just use when they're labeling bacteria, they just put the first capital letter of it and then put tetani in the end. And it's usually in italics. All right, so we'll just call it C. tetani. All right, by the way, imagine you didn't need oxygen. Imagine an organism that doesn't need oxygen. Like we need oxygen, right? But C. tetani, let's put it back up here. Should we stick with white? Let's stick with white. Make sure it's working. There we go. So C. period tetani, this bacteria, it doesn't need oxygen. Does not need oxygen. In fact, if it has oxygen, it couldn't survive. It cannot survive in oxygen, or we would say in an oxygen environment. You might be saying, well, then how could it affect us? It can't survive. There's oxygen everywhere, right? It cannot survive in an oxygen environment. Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to how they can get in. So they're in our soil, and that's true. They cannot survive in oxygen. So what happens is they do send out spores, which I'll talk about in a minute. And again, when you were younger, you probably may have heard about someone, or maybe it was you, and it happened to me, right? I remember that you got a rusty nail somehow punctured your skin. That's how C. tetani enters your body. It enters your body through a puncture wound. So it enters the body. It's actually the spores are entering your body. We'll talk about those spores in a minute. So they enters your body through a wound. Right? It's usually a puncture wound, like a rusty nail. You always hear about this rusty nail. Not the drink. There's a drink called a rusty nail, by the way. And it's not the rust. The rust does not cause it. Rust does not cause tetanus, no. Or lockjaw. I'll say lockjaw right now. You can imagine why it's called lockjaw, because your jaw locks. We'll go over those systems. So rust does not cause it. It's the puncture wound that causes it, and the bacteria, spores that are on it. All right, so let's talk about these spores. I'll clean this plate, clear it out, keep up the white. So what happens is, since it cannot survive in oxygen, the bacteria, and certain bacteria do this, they will send out spores. And it's basically, let's say this was the bacteria, floating around. It'll send out this kind of spore, like an. Well, it's not an egg, but you can think of it as an egg for now for an analogy. This spore, and this spore can survive in very harsh environments. So the spores are released. But the spores are released, and we should just say one spore. Right, the bacteria, one spore will be released from this bacteria. So if there's many bacteria, there's many C. tetani in the area, they'll release these spores. They're released when the environmental conditions are not good. In this case, there's a lot of oxygen, right? So there is we can just also say unfavorable. The bacteria won't survive. So what they do is they send out these spores, and these spores will survive. And these spores can survive thousands of years. They can lie dormant, and some even have them. There's some claims that they're way over 10,000 years old. Some of these spores. So what these spores do is they limit energy. Right? They limit energy. They're in this kind of dormant state until they find a host to invade. So think about it. These spores are tough. We have tough spores. They're tough. They can survive very harsh environments. They can survive high heat. Talking perhaps 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And they can live for a long time. Like I said before, 10,000 years or more maybe, until they find a host. So these spores are what's in the soil. They're in dust. They're in manure. And when they find a host, for example, you puncture your skin, maybe with a rusty nail, since everybody always uses the rusty nail analogy, the spores get in, and they could release toxins in your body that can cause tetanus. And here's a little animation, cartoon of it. So the top right over here, get our pen going. So the top is the bacteria. It's a rod shaped. Remember, gram positive, rod shape. And let's say harsh environments come in play. It's not going to survive, so it will create a spore. So there's the spore, and then the spore is released into the soil. Could be released into manure. Could be released into dust. Right, and so all it wants is a puncture wound, and it will enter your body, and in your body, it will release toxins. And these toxins could produce stiffness, muscle stiffness, lockjaw, where you can hardly open your mouth. That's dangerous, right? Spasms, muscle spasms, breathing problems. And if it keeps going, it perhaps can lead to death. Perhaps. The good news is there's a vaccination for this. And there's also good news if you do have tetanus, if the doctor does show that you do have tetanus, well, then we do have remedies for it. Not like in the past, perhaps. So there is a vaccination, and they can treat it. Very important. So just to close, if you're feeling a fever, if you have a fever and you're sweating, and you have this your jaw is cramping up, you're getting this kind of lockjaw, right? Hence the name lockjaw. You're getting muscle stiffness, you're having trouble swallowing, you have a headache, maybe your heart rate is increasing and stuff like that. Well, obviously you should go see a doctor. But it could be tetanus or it could not be tetanus, depends. But obviously if you had a puncture wound at one point and you're feeling these, well, then you could have tetanus. Well, see a doctor. All right, that's our video today.